We're going to start off the Q&A today with some questions that have been submitted by you and your colleagues during the registration, and then we'll move to adding in ones that are being submitted live as well. And Julia, in your presentation, when you started talking about the challenge of urban, you mentioned that a lot of the challenges of scale. And I think that it's not a surprise that in an urban crisis that needs are often at a large scale. And one of the questions that's come in, and I think I'll go to Tahir first on this one because we haven't yet heard from him, is about the potential of risks for distorting the market with such a large scale of need. And if the need becomes a large scale cash program, how do you anticipate the potential risk of distorting the market with a large scale cash program? And also then how do you mitigate this risk once you've anticipated it? So I'll turn over to Tahir and hear your thoughts first.
Thank you, Leah, and thanks to the presenters for their very interesting presentations. Indeed, there are risks of distorting the market in large-scale cash programs, but I would hasten to say that perhaps maybe urban crises or crises that lead to people moving into urban areas and therefore putting pressure on the market. But we need to, but perhaps as some of the presenters have also said, is that in some of these urban areas, you're much more likely to find larger markets, accessible markets, different types of markets than you might necessarily find in rural areas. So looking at distorting the markets needs to be something that permeates any type of cash-based program, whether urban or rural. How do we anticipate these possible distortions in the market? We do that through pre-assessments. So we try to take a look at these markets through our supply chain expertise in WFP, and we look at that market not just at the retail level. We actually do a supply chain sort of analysis to see, okay, here are the retailers, this is the types of foods available, these are sort of general prices, but where do those retailers get their supplies? And so we trace backwards to see the wholesale market. Who are the wholesalers? What are their what do they look like in terms of capacity, robustness, throughput? If they're getting their supplies from local production, we try to understand where that local production is and try to understand to what extent there might be distortions. Should it be, say, agricultural products that might be affected by a current, I don't know, rainfall shortage or something like that. In other words, or if these food items that we're particularly looking at are not produced locally and are imported, we trace back to see who these importers are, how big are they, how regularly do they bring in, what kinds of quantities. In other words, to try to see that whole supply chain to see whether we think that that market is going to be sufficiently robust to be able to respond to the additional demand that a cash program will generate through the increased purchasing power of people. So part of that is the pre-assessment, and that's one of the elements that we look at in WFP as part of our modality selection analysis. Is this market going to be able to respond? Is it big enough and strong enough to be able to meet the needs of these people without distorting markets, inflation, short supplies, which of course not only affect the people that everybody's trying to assist, but affects the population at large. How do we mitigate these types of possible distortions? It's through regular, constant monitoring. We deploy our food, actually maybe probably not food monitors anymore, but our monitors, our field monitors, and they're constantly looking at things like prices, they're constantly visiting markets, they're constantly trying to see what might be the possible negative impacts that our program might be having on the markets. And clearly those, if we start to see signals that are worrying, this should trigger a discussion at the country office level to see whether continuation in using that particular transfer modality, i.e. cash, is advisable, or whether we need to think about using a different type of support. So in terms of mitigation, these are the really just day-to-day, week-to-week data collection on market related variables and indicators that will then indicate to us our cash program is not causing any distortion or very minor distortions, or if these programs are causing serious problems, and in which case we would want to move to a different transfer modality.
Perfect. Thanks to hear. I'll switch over to Julia as well, because I know you mentioned scale as a challenge in your presentation. I don't know if you have any further thoughts on this particular question as well.
No, I think Tahir has really hit it. I think it's about the market assessment and the market analysis at the very beginning, which will then also help identifying potential challenges and mitigating measures, and then monitoring throughout and having that flexibility to adapt the program according. And I think with the monitoring, the important thing is to see if there are changes, are those changes linked to our programs or are they external? And then of course, that will dictate a little bit of the response. So I think those are kind of the two main things that I would also underline.
Okay, great. And one of the things that Tahir just mentioned in terms of risk is that that's one of the considerations for selecting the modality. And this is something we got quite a few questions on when people were registering about how you determine the best modality for use in an urban context, and also whether there are different risks to account for with different modalities. So I think this one flows nicely from what we were just talking about. And also, Mariana, in your presentation, you mentioned that in urban there are often more options for modality or mechanism to choose from. So maybe I'll start with you and pose a question to you. How do you figure out, with so many choices, how do you figure out what is the best modality to use in the urban context?
Sure. I think part of our process, and I think this is independent of whether it's urban or rural, is we consider a variety of criteria to figure out what is the best modality, and these include thinking about first of all, what's our program objective? What's the purpose of this cash? What do we want this cash grant to support? Typically for us in the immediate aftermath of the disaster, we're typically doing unconditional grants to help meet vulnerable populations' immediate needs. But other criteria that we consider is, again, speed. How quickly can we issue the cash grants, and how quickly can we deliver the cash grants, and what type of payment mechanism will allow us to do that? Thinking about, again, ability to scale up if we are reaching a large number of people. For example, in the example of Nepal, the target with the response operation we were implementing as part of the IFRC response, reaching 40,000 households, that's quite a large scale. So thinking about what can we do quickly and in that scale. So again, there's a lot of criteria, including program objectives, speed, what allows us to be flexible, how can we scale up, and I think most importantly, thinking about the beneficiaries we have in mind, what's their preference, what is acceptable to them, what they're comfortable with. So again, taking all of that into account, we definitely do an analysis of all these criteria and think of what works best in the given context we're in. In terms of cash and envelopes, sometimes I would instinctively say for urban areas, probably just from a high-level perspective, wouldn't necessarily be the first go-to choice. In Nepal, mostly rural areas, and we felt that there weren't significant risks. We consulted with a lot of the communities and stakeholders, and again, managed distribution so they wouldn't be quite large-scale distributions. Because again, that was a consideration in that given context. In other urban disasters in Ecuador, for example, we issued prepaid cards. So that way beneficiaries would receive the card. It wasn't something that was very visible. So ultimately, I think it's just a matter of looking at all your objectives, what beneficiaries will prefer, what will allow you to be flexible and be able to deliver cash, at least for the emergency context, as quickly as possible to support people with their needs. And it really is quite a balancing act, and I would emphasize that what's important in doing this assessment of determining the best modality is really engaging your stakeholders in the discussion so that you're accounting for all different perspectives as you're looking through all these criteria.
Great, thanks so much, Mariana. I think Anthony might have some thoughts to add to this one as well, so I'll turn over to him next.
Yes, so quickly, so before, here in Iran, before choosing the best modality, we actually first ask ourselves if the urban economy is actually cash-based or not. Then, so if it was not cash-based, we would have considered any kind of assistance. Then we ask ourselves if the most vulnerable have access to those markets, and if the goods, basic goods available for the most vulnerable are usually accessible to these urban markets. So we ask all these primary questions, and then we review the various options available. It's not because they are available that these services are accessible, so we were very cautious about that. So we study different institutions, banks, post offices, money transfer businesses, mobile phone companies, what's available, what's accessible. We took into account as well the costs per beneficiary, cards, check, transfer fees, the hidden costs, is there any withdrawal fees, startup costs, and then the option has been reviewed in a ranking in terms of okay, time to travel to the location to receive the cash, proximity to the beneficiary's home, the flexibility as well, and the portability of the mechanism. We use the type of matrix, I would say, like scoring matrix for deciding the most appropriate CBI. So we try to score in terms of accessibility, control, discretion, simplicity, flexibility, to come up with the best solution possible. Here again, we, as Mariana was saying, is also what's the preference of the beneficiaries. So we really took this into account and weighed the pros and cons to choose the best accessible modality.
Great, thanks very much, Anthony. I mean, the title of this webinar it's about urban. It's also about cash, but it's also about food security. And we are doing the webinar in partnership with the Urban Working Group of the Food Security Cluster. So I think it makes sense to bring in the next question, which is, you know, cash by its very nature can be used for anything, really. Once someone has the amount, they can, you know, use it as they see fit. How can it be used to improve food security specifically, in particular? How do you monitor the impact of cash for food security? And is there a reason to focus on food security and not just on basic needs? So that's a lot of questions all in one that I'll turn to Julia first to give some thoughts about.
Yeah, I think those are very valid questions, and I would start off by saying that you know, we started, I think, with cash primarily looking at food security indicators, and more now we see actors and donors opening up and thinking of cash as, again, a modality to cover multiple needs. And we are seeing, I would argue, more programming that are very much aimed at covering multi-sectorial needs of a certain population. But of course, I think cash, yes, it is very important for food security, and I think this goes back to your initial assessment and looking at the need of the population that you're looking to serve. And again, I think if food security and food needs are the primarily needs that are identified within that target population, then cash can be a very powerful tool to support those efforts. Again, the added value of cash, you know, like vouchers, they increase the choice, they empower beneficiaries, they support the local economy, and there's lots of added value. Of course, monitoring the results in a cash intervention that has as a primary objective improvement in food security indicators is a bit of the tricky part. And I think, I mean, here we go back to our usual tools of on-site monitoring and post-activity monitoring. We look at key food security indicators and try to kind of assess potential changes and link them up to our assistance. But of course, it's more challenging, or can be more challenging. And one thing that I know we found very helpful also to better understand households' purchasing patterns, at least for CRS, and in the case of this urban response, was the use of e-vouchers. which through this platform at Rose, we were able to very much understand and have exact information on what beneficiaries are buying and what they were purchasing. And that was kind of an additional element and information to help us triangulate and then link to the results of on food security indicators. So again, yes, I would say that you know, cash has an important role to play, but I think it would then go back again to what the need of that population is, and yeah, and that would be the main driving question.
Perfect. Thanks, Julia. I want to turn to Tahir as well to get perhaps a World Food Programme perspective on this one as well.
Thank you very much, and indeed I very much agree with what Julia is saying. And really, I fully agree in the sense that if your intervention is to address a food security problem, then those are the types of things that you're monitoring for and looking for those types of outcomes from your intervention. And we don't particularly in WFP we're not particularly bothered about whether we're using cash or food or vouchers to address these food security problems that we're trying to address, primarily because of our targeting. So as long as we're fairly sure that we got our targeting quite right, I can't ever believe that we're ever going to get proper, fully 100% correct targeting. But once you get your targeting correct, and you've targeted the people that are facing food insecurity problems, we all know that they're going to spend the majority of their cash transfer on food. And therefore, we should see improvements in food consumption scores, we should see improvements in dietary diversities, and so those types of food security indicators should show improvement. Indeed, as Julia said, you could restrict that cash, so you can make it a voucher, electronic or otherwise, and that way you can kind of steer the expenditure, not 100% as always, but you can steer that expenditure and the purchasing of people towards the purchase of food. I'll make a little aside, which is by restricting cash to food items, that doesn't stop people from buying, does not necessarily stop people from buying junk food. So if there are nutrition problems in some areas where I've worked, say in Palestine, where one of the nutrition problems is child obesity, the fact that people are restricted to buying food from shops that are contracted by WFP does not necessarily mean that people are going to buy the right foods from a nutrition perspective. So that needs to be implemented with things like communication strategies that help transmit information to people about nutritious foods, nutritious eating habits, and so on and so forth. And that sort of brings me to the basic needs question is, well, if we are transferring cash to meet basic needs, which include food, but then include other elements, indeed you will need to be trying to monitor for, and in fact we think because people spend a majority of their cash on food, but if they do have additional cash resources to do things that are going to be complementary to achieving food security, for example, getting access to clean drinking water, another huge component of getting people's food security and their nutritional status improved. So moving into multi-purpose cash and to cover the basic needs of people, including the component of food security, if food security is a problem, we then need to do sort of monitoring of these other indicators in terms of if we're providing transfers for shelter, we hope to see improvements in where people are living, etc., etc. Thank you.
Great, thanks Tahir. I'm going to turn to Anthony for the next question, which I'm going to bundle together. We have a broader question, a more particular question that's come in following on your presentation. So I'm going to put them together to give you a few things to comment on. The broad question is about protection risks for cash programming in urban settings and what those particularly might be in urban settings and how they can be addressed. And a question which I think is in some ways related and in other ways a separate issue is about host communities. And you mentioned the huge, I mean, I think the stat was 97% of the refugees living in an urban area, living right next to host communities. People are wondering on the line, does the program that you're working on also target host communities? And if so, how does that go? And if not, have you had any kind of challenges where the host community is not supported by the program and only the refugees are? So over to you, Anthony.
Yes, thank you. So first, I would say that yes, cash-based intervention should always consider and analyze the protection risks, the mitigation measures, and the benefits. The analysis, as also Tahir was saying, should look specifically at the gender and the social impacts of cash. But I want to say as well that cash or vouchers alone cannot address the root causes of protection with individuals or institutional issues. So it's important for the organization to mainstream protection, so to target the most vulnerable. And here it's interesting that we need to be impartial and target the most vulnerable. So I was talking about the documented, the undocumented, and it's interesting because cash should not raise tension with host communities. So, for instance, in Jordan, where most of the Syrian refugees are living in host communities, Jordanian vulnerable households were as well included in the cash assistance in order to mitigate potential tensions. So here, I think it's very important to keep that in mind. The cash should also enhance safety and dignity. Here, we have also to be a bit cautious because urban programming handles a large volume of data, and how can we make sure that we protect this sensitive data sometimes, especially when we're talking about possibly undocumented refugees? How can we make sure that we include what I called previously the urban poor, so targeting the most vulnerable, those with sometimes high illiteracy rates, those who may have illegal stay or don't want to be found, keeping in mind our humanitarian principle as well. So it's important to understand the dynamics of the society, the communities, as well as understanding the dynamic inside the households. How can we promote and protect the well-being of the households without contributing to discrimination, abuse, or exploitation of any section of the population? So this is something also as well to keep in mind. And I would say as well that it's always interesting to integrate cash with other longer-term intervention. So provision of information on access to services, documentation, or information on skills training available, information on access to education, as well as referral to other partners, for instance, for further adequate assistance.
Thanks, Anthony. Next, I'm going to turn to Julia and ask a question that's come in about coordination with, I think this goes back to the nature of the scale of an urban environment, as well as having a huge number of affected people. You often then, depending on the nature of the crisis, but you often can have a huge number of organizations responding, of actors just in general. And so how do you coordinate cash in a dense urban environment where there are so many organizations who might be operating there?
Yeah, I think that's a very valid question. And again, I would agree that the sheer number of actors and the proximity of the different intervention coupled with population density very much increase the risk if coordination doesn't happen well. So one thing that I would say is the urban profile of the environment require potentially coordinating not only on who does what where, but very much a very detailed level of coordination, especially in cash and voucher programming. So transfer value would be looked at, what are different agencies paying for service fees paid to money transfer agencies. Targeting becomes again extremely important if agencies are working in either similar neighborhoods or nearby neighborhoods. how they're doing their market monitoring and so forth. So I think the first point is the level of detail in terms of coordination is potentially a different scale than you would in a rural environment. One way that in some urban contexts actors have worked around this is by taking what they call, or what CRS calls, a neighborhood approach. So here what you have is an agency that might be implementing one or more activities in one sector, taking the lead in coordinating all actors intervening in that area. And the idea is to, again, break down this larger urban city into smaller, more manageable portions, and then very much trying to streamline as much as possible the activities within that one area. So again, instead of having multiple actors doing multiple registration processes, having this kind of one neighborhood approach where you would have one agency taking the lead and then working with the other actors to harmonize approaches and coordinate. What we found with CRS in the Maiduguri context that was also very helpful is, there's a repetition geographically of the different bodies. So CRS took these two areas, and we carried out multi-sectoral activities and intervention. And this was very helpful for us because we were able to kind of draw on the different sectors' expertise and tools. So we had a WASH programming, shelter programming, food security programming, and NFI, all within these two areas. And just to give you a very concrete example, a lot of the geographical and household targeting was done through this with the support of our WASH colleagues who have very developed and are very well equipped with mobilization and community mapping tools. And so the food security colleagues were very much able to draw on those experiences and approaches to then inform our programming and the targeting and so forth. So by kind of combining forces, that's one approach to coordination and avoiding kind of multiplication of efforts and so forth. And of course, kind of building system and knowledge, which I think is key to urban programming, is really understanding the areas where you're working in and really being able to identify key stakeholders and roles and responsibility and so forth. So those are things that I would say help coordination and improve coordination within an urban context.
Great, thanks, Julia, very much for that. I'm going to keep moving on. We only have about 15 minutes left and a huge list of questions, so I'll get right to it. We've had a few questions come in, I think based on the fact that it came up in a few of the presentations about feedback mechanisms and what the most useful feedback mechanisms might be in urban or in relation to cash. I'm going to turn to Mariana to see if across the wealth of experiences that American Red Cross has been involved in, if there's any thoughts about feedback mechanisms and their utility in urban contexts or specific to cash responses.
Sure. Well, definitely in all our cash programs, we certainly aim to have feedback mechanisms. We refer to them as a beneficiary communication and accountability systems. And these range, again, depending on context and environment. What's important with the feedback mechanisms is to establish mechanisms that the beneficiaries or your target population will actually use, that they're familiar with, that it's something that they're comfortable with. So that can range in for example, in rural context. Sometimes in Nepal, we've done suggestion boxes, and again, communicating to suggestions and feedback boxes and communicating to beneficiaries, put in your feedback, we'll come collect it, we'll review it, we'll make sure that we're following up on it. To more urban contexts, like in Ecuador and even Dominica, we set up a hotline where people would call, we'd document the call and just notice if it's just kind of feedback on the program or complaining about a challenge in the cash program, whether it's someone saying, based on your beneficiary criteria, I'm supposed to be eligible, or I've received my card but it's not working, and ensuring that we have adequate follow-up and timely follow-up. So I think in terms of the actual feedback mechanisms, there's a variety of those, and I think it's a matter of implementing or putting forth a balance of somewhere that allow people to also provide feedback anonymously. So, for example, when we've set hotlines, the people responding to or recording the feedback on the hotlines are not associated or are not closely involved with the program, so to provide that distance, and also giving people the opportunity, if they're comfortable, to provide feedback directly. So coming to the local Red Cross office and noting their feedback. Another important point with these feedback and accountability mechanisms, I think the importance, I think, is also that it's important to have those readily available as soon as we're even thinking of the program. For us, those feedback and accountability mechanisms are not only just for our target beneficiaries of our cash program, but for the greater community. And they serve as well to ensure that, by the time you're reaching your cash distributions, people are aware of what the program's for, who that program's targeted, they're clear on who's eligible for that program or not. And again, key to that is also ensuring that we are doing adequate follow-up.
Great, thanks, Mariana. I'm going to quickly turn back to Julia as well to add some more thoughts on this one.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that I think in an urban context, what we'll be seeing is that more feedback mechanisms are probably better than just one, or just one, which is maybe what we would use or prefer in a rural context. So multiplying the way that people can provide feedback, again, to address the fact that you have a variety and a very diverse population. And again, looking critically, if you're intervening with an urban context in different areas, at whether or not they would be the same type of feedback mechanism or different. And of course, the tricky thing here is that the more ways that people can provide their inputs, the more it becomes to manage. But I think in an urban environment, again, talking about these multitude of profiles and different level of understanding and background, and potentially less social cohesion and less of a community feel, multiplying feedback mechanism can be very helpful in making sure that you're reaching everyone and that everyone has access and a voice.
Great, thanks, Julia. One of the last question areas I'm going to pose, and I'll turn first to Tahir, so I'll give you advanced warning, is there's quite a few questions come in around the topic of informality. And I think those of us who know about urban context recognize the huge amount of informality that exists in any city, really. And how do you account for this informality, the informal markets? Some specific questions that have come in are about whether certain mechanisms have more of a positive or any kind of impact on informal petty traders, as well as in terms of thinking about vouchers and the potential of pre-selecting designated vendors. Does that undermine existing kind of market patterns or networks that might be informal if people are used to, doing their shopping through informal markets? Does selecting a more formal shop to use in a voucher program, does that disturb the informality that exists, that is the reality of a lot of urban spaces? So I'll turn first to hear your thoughts about informality.
Thank you, Leah. We recently conducted what we called an experiment in Lebanon and in Jordan, in which we designated some of the Syrian refugees to be able to use their electronic voucher to remain as an electronic voucher. We gave a similar group of households the option that their card would then only operate as an ATM, and therefore they could go and withdraw cash. And we did a third group in which the same number of households were given a choice. That card could either work as the ATM or work at the shops, and people had the choice to decide. They could either use it all as cash, they could go and spend some cash and use some cash and then use some of the resources that they had on their card in the shops. We found that, in fact, a lot of the people who were given the cash option, their use of the WFP shops dropped significantly. They really not stopped completely, but only about 20% of the amounts of money that were loaded on their cards were actually used in shops that WFP had contracted. And we asked where did these people go and buy their food items, and it became very clear that they they were very sensible shoppers. So they would go and buy, for example, their fruits and vegetables at fruit and vegetable stands where they could get a better deal on basically the same quality of food that they could have gotten at the WFP shop. And yet they were going back to the WFP shop for specific items that they knew would be on sale or cheaper than if they were to buy it elsewhere. All to say that I'm not familiar with the term informality, but I think I've sort of gotten what you're pointing to. But in fact, one of the things that when we were talking about our intervention for the Syrian refugees in Lebanon, Jordan specifically, one of our fears was that in both these countries, the retail sector was very solid, very well established, very well integrated. And therefore, we were worried that if we gave people cash, that in fact they would go to markets that were less well integrated, less robust, and that's where we might start to see some of these distortions that we were talking about earlier. We don't have the data that will tell us if there have been any distortive effects in terms of people using their cash in smaller markets, as far as we could tell at the moment, and we have one last round of monitoring that we need to do to be able to come to a conclusion on this, but nothing at the moment indicates that there's been any, let's say, negative effects on these informal markets. And in fact, people have been, let's say, making their transfers work better for them in terms of variety and quantity of food that they could purchase with the given transfer. You hinted about something about the shops that we contract and so on. And we have different experiences. Lebanon, perhaps Jordan, where a lot of the there is a huge retail sector. It's pretty well accessible. In the refugee camps, for example, in Jordan, we had to sort of contract a supermarket to establish a presence at the camp. But really, the selection of stores, we try to do it pretty much like what CRS was talking about in Maiduguri, really trying to make sure that those shops are selected on the basis of proximity to where most of the people are, or at least that we have sufficient number of shops so that they're in close proximity to where the people that we were serving were located. I'm not sure I've covered everything you wanted me to talk about, Leah, but if there are more specific issues, I'm more than happy to contribute further.
Great, thanks to hear. And as we get into the last few minutes of the webinar, I'll start making my final rounds for final comments from our various speakers. I'll turn now to Anthony to see both if you have any further thoughts to add to Here's thoughts about informality and the impact on the informal sector of cash programs, as well as any thoughts you have about the challenges that still remain relating to urban cash programming and what evidence we still need to gather and how we need to get it going forward.
Yes, I think it goes back to what Tahir said. I think the beneficiaries of cash assistance, they know very well their preferences, how to use the cash and where to go to get the best value for what they receive. So this is quite interesting to engage with the community and to have proper understanding of the dynamics in the targeted communities to really understand this. In terms of challenges relating to urban cash programming, I think there is still the question of how can cash-based intervention with other objectives, such as food security, for instance, more concretely incorporate protection objectives into the program design. And there have been several surveys and literature review about protection outcomes in cash-based interventions, but there are some still contradictory findings. So this, I would say, it's still a challenge to properly understand this. Then can be also tracing to the challenges to cash transfer are not apolitical, I would say. So how do we, as humanitarian actors, analyze and integrate concerns about social relations into our cash program designs? And then still the issue of targeting. And for instance, this goes back to the point that Julia touched about these dense urban environments where it can be difficult to coordinate cash programming. In Jordan, for instance, in the Middle East, there was some online refugee assistance information system where the NGO could enter and avoid duplication, understand the vulnerability. So this was a good practice, but still a lot of challenges remain.
Great, thanks, Anthony. And a similar question to Mariana, just as we wrap up. Any thoughts on the challenges that still remain regarding urban cash programming and what evidence is missing and how we get it and move forward?
Yeah, I would also say, again, we've all the panelists have touched on this, that in terms of targeting and then just the scale of cash programming, it can be complex in urban settings. So I think one of the challenges, the main challenges I see, is being able to deliver cash in a timely manner and also at scale. And I think a key part to this is really putting that emphasis on the preparedness component of delivery of cash. So being able to understand just community structures and how they're organized and how they work, and what populations you're working with, and also just being able to do advocacy for cash transfer programming prior to the need to do it. So while in rural settings, if at least for us from our experience, if a disaster happens and we are looking to implement a cash program and we're talking to community leaders, we may be just dealing with a handful of people who we're talking with and working with to get their buy-in and support. In an urban context, it's multiple layers of leadership and buy-in and several different types of stakeholders. And so in order to deliver cash in a timely manner, I think some of this advocacy work can be done beforehand. Similarly, while there is also a variety of payment mechanisms available in an urban context, just being able to, again, have a clear understanding of what these are and whether the populations we're actually targeting use these and are comfortable with it. So I think just a challenge, and I think a need, is being able to focus more on cash preparedness in urban contexts.
Great, thanks, Mariana. And for the last word, I'll turn to Julia just for any final comments and takeaways, particularly around the difference between rural and urban cash as you go forward. Anything you'd like to share for final comments, Julia?
Sure. I think maybe the last and final comment on my end would be that although cities and urban context, as we've seen today, do pose quite a few big challenges and different challenges, they also do present us with great opportunities. And I think these are, in some settings, linked to improved connectivity or agile markets, this ability to potentially work in more of a multi-sectoral approach and than rural context and so forth. And so I think if appropriately kind of harnessed and leveraged, the urban setting can actually help us improve effectiveness and efficiency of response. And so although contexts such as Maiduguri and others are very different, and as Mariana was saying, many different layers and many stakeholders and a lot of unknown, I think they also present great opportunities. And if we can find a way of harnessing them, then we can most likely be able to reach more and in a better and more efficient way their beneficiaries.
Great, thanks, Julia. I think that's a really great end thought to close on. So as we reach 3:30 here in the UK, I'll say thank you to all of our speakers today, as well as those who helped to organize the webinar, those behind the scenes today, and as well you, the audience, for sitting through the last hour and a half with us. I know that there are tons of questions we haven't gotten to, and so we do have the great opportunity of having the Urban Response Community of Practice, which if you're not already a member of, you'll receive an invitation to join in the next day or two, where we'll hopefully put some of the questions that haven't been answered or those that require further discussion and experiences shared into the COP. My last request before I say goodbye to you all is that when the webinar ends, you'll see a survey pop up on your screen. It's quite quick, and it really helps us to get some feedback for future webinars to know exactly what you thought of today's session. So please do fill that out. Thank you once again, and we look forward to your participation in future webinars. So with that, I will bid you all a very nice day, and thank you again for taking the time to join us for this webinar. Goodbye.